Okay. Let's see, share a different screen. Okay, can everybody see my screen? Okay. So in trying to review some of our current processes and things like that, we started discussing just documentation in general and just some best practices that we want to use. Obviously, I see a lot of this from a monitoring perspective, but just in general, some best practices. A lot of this is probably going to seem pretty basic or everyday. This is not calling out anyone in particular. So if you do these things, then that's great. You're ahead of the game. If you don't do these things, maybe this is something you could implement. And if you have questions about any of these things, you can ask about them now, or you can reach out to me later if it's something that you're not aware of or you haven't done before and you would like to implement. So just let me know. So some of the things we're going to talk about are do's and don'ts. Documentation of consent is a pretty big one. And then I also want to talk about what can be stored electronically, because I know those binders are getting huge and you're probably running out of places to put everything. Note to files, and then our source documentation. So I gave a few examples here, and I will go into more detail with that. So some do's and don'ts. A lot of these you guys are not doing wrong. So I only highlighted a few. Writing legibly is a huge thing. When you work with someone day in and day out, you get used to seeing their writing, knowing who it is. But when I am just joining, hi, does someone have a question?
No, I just came on.
Okay. It's really hard. So if somebody has, like a really unique signature, or if you just don't have good writing in general, I would recommend printing your name, even if there's not like a line to print your name, so I can see who did it. I know a lot of the paper forms say signature, but if you write a signature and it's just like, this little scribble, it would be nice to print your name there as well. And then anything that I can't read may potentially be a finding, something that we have to fix. So the neater you can write something, the better, less things that we have to go back and fix later. The other thing I'm going to point out here is to record all communication to a subject. This doesn't mean word for word or recording it or anything, but we have a lot of people that have been noted as lost to follow up. And so there have been some questions about how that process works. We don't necessarily have a document like an SOP for lost to follow up. I know some institutions do. At previous institutions that we did have an SOP for this. But if somebody doesn't come to one visit, that doesn't necessarily mean they're lost to follow up. And if we are going to document them as lost to follow up, then there needs to be some documentation of when you called them to reach out to them, how many times you called to reach out to them. If you call one time, they miss a visit, and then nobody ever follows up, that's not truly lost to follow up. It may be lost to follow up for that instant, but what is considered lost to follow up as far as research documentation, that's not necessarily that. So we just need to, I think there's a contact log. I know IU uses one. I believe there's one for the program that you can download and use, and just reach out and say, subject 1234 missed week 4, called them on May 6th at 11:05 a.m., left a message. We'll try back again in 2 days or something like that, or next week, however your typical call follow-up goes. I would do that a few times, and then if you can't get a hold of them, that's when I would document them as lost to follow up. Another question that was asked, we had people kind of going back retroactively trying to fix things, and they were noting lost to follow up for their missed visits, but then they were coming in for subsequent visits. So if they miss a visit, that's a different thing. That's documentation that we have to do for the missed visit, or if it's out of window or something like that. But if they do come in for the subsequent visits, then they weren't considered lost to follow-up at that missed visit, even if they didn't call you back. Lost to follow-up is more like, we're never getting a hold of that person again since the last time we were in contact with them for whatever reason. They moved, they don't want to answer our call, they don't have the phone number, whatever the reason is. Okay, so another thing I wanted to point out is if something important happens after your documentation has been completed, then you can add a late entry in there. So if everything's done, you've completed all your paper CRFs, you've entered everything into REDCap, and then something comes up later that maybe you didn't see in the EMR, or a doctor or somebody points it out to you later, you can always add that and just put a late entry note in with that documentation, and that's completely acceptable. I would also put your initials, the date and time with that late entry. But it's better to put something late that's very pertinent to telling that patient's story, rather than omitting it and never putting it in there, and then us needing to go back and put it in later. And then you should document often enough to tell the whole story. So essentially, a chart is a patient's story. So from the time you had the very first initial contact with them to when we no longer have any contact with them, or when the study's over, it tells the story of when they were there, their treatment, and their follow-up, all of that. Some of the don'ts. Some of these are more for people charting, at bedside, but I put this first one here: don't chart a symptom or an event without also charting what you did or are going to do. And I related this to adverse events. So if you're putting adverse events on your log, but then you're leaving everything else blank and not filling that in as close to real time as possible, it's really hard to go back retroactively and remember all of those details. So I know sometimes during visits, I would take notes and, ask them how they were doing. They would say, oh, I've had nausea, I've had vomiting, how long has that been going on? And I write all these notes. And then if you put it in the log, nausea, vomiting, but then you never put, what grade, how long did it last? Did they need anything for it? Those things, then it's not completely documented. And then here's one of my favorites that's been happening a lot. A lot of fellows, I think, and residents do this. There's a lot of shorthand and abbreviations. I am constantly looking things up, like, what is this? And sometimes to my surprise, I'm like, okay, that really is an abbreviation. And then other times it's like, no, I have no idea what it is. So in your documentation, try to use abbreviations that are definitely widely accepted and that people are going to know. If not, at least from a monitoring visit, I will probably reach out and say, hey, I don't know what this means. So don't be surprised if that happens. And then don't chart ahead of time. So this isn't happening a lot in like procedures or anything like that, but I will say that sometimes the prescription for drugs are being made completely with everything that a patient needs to be discharged with to go home. And then maybe they find out that the pharmacy doesn't have all of the drug or something like that. That's happened in a few instances. So then I get in there in a monitoring visit and it looks like this person was discharged with all of their drug. Then I go later to accountability and it's like, no, they were only discharged with, 8 pills and we had to ship them something later. But it's very confusing because nowhere is it charted that that prescription changed because of, drug availability or something like that. So just make sure that if something like that does happen, maybe you wrote the prescription to IDS, went to get it and then they didn't have it, just make sure that you're charting if there is any kind of variation in something like that. Okay. So poor documentation and errors. So this is kind of a quote that I found that I like, and it just says, when documentation is accurate and complete, tells the patient's story and helps to improve healthcare. And not improving healthcare, at least for this trial, it's improving how efficient we can be in visits and how efficient we can, with our patients, with our subjects, how efficient we can be in monitoring visits. Obviously, no one no one person or any of these processes are perfect. That's why we're always trying to improve them. So poor documentation, it's lacking clarity, specificity, or completeness. Overall poor quality and inhibits the clear presentation of the patient's story. So we want to prevent that. On the next slide, I'm going to talk about the Alcoa C principles if you've never heard of those. Or if you have, it'll just be a little reminder. And then some of the ways we fix some of these documentation errors is through a note to file, especially if it's been quite a while since the error occurred. But the biggest thing I want to point out is just a single line through the error, initial and date it. That way the original documentation is still there. It's not obstructed. So it can be seen what was written incorrectly and how it was corrected. So the Alcoa C principles stand for attributable, legible, contemporaneous, original, accurate, and complete. So we should be able to look at documentation, figure out who did it. It should go back to a person, a date, a visit, very easily. Legible, I've kind of talked about this already, and this is one of the recommendations here, you know, especially signatures. I would say that's probably one of the biggest issues in legibility is signatures. Contemporaneous, all this really means is in real time. So if you are documenting and then entering REDCap much later, I mean, that happens. We're all busy. We have huge workloads. But if you're not documenting that original paper CRF and then you're behind on data entry 2, makes it very difficult to get that information going back. You have to be like a detective or do a whole separate research study just to try to find the information that you could have had originally during their visit. So there is, you know, some acceptable amounts of delay and some ways that we can record things like that. If your institution has an acceptable amount of delay, I know at the Cancer Center, it was you had to have all of your documentation complete before their next visit. And typically those were 3-week intervals. And then, you know, data entry had, you know, 10 or 15 business days. So if you do have some kind of acceptable amount of delay, have that documented and let me know. And I would also let IUTCC know if you have institutional policies for that as well. And then again, we talked about the late entry. And then anything that maybe you just missed it, or maybe the person didn't come and then they called later or something like that. You just want to put that in as soon as you know the information, and then also put the time there and date as well. So original, first record of information. We're going to talk about this a lot when we're talking about source documents. So I'm not going to go into it too much, but basically entering it in REDCap is just a database. It's a place to collect data, collate it, for it to be analyzed. It is not considered the original source of data. Accurate. We want it to be consistent. We want it to represent what's actually going on for the patient for that visit. And then complete. This is one of the biggest things. Some of the things, the fields are not able to be completed in real time. You're waiting on a lab, you're waiting on a response from a PI, those things. So always fill out as much as you can. And then we can always go back, but trying to get those complete to the best of your ability in real time is really important. And then if you're having any difficulties getting something complete because of it's a confusing field, or you can't get to, you know, you can't get to your PI in real time. You guys are still working from home quite often, something like that. It's just good to let us know if there's any issues like that going on. I'm going to stop right here and see if anybody has any questions over anything we've gone over so far. Everyone good? Okay. Oh, somebody want to say something? Okay. So documentation of consent. This is a requirement for this study. For the most part, everybody has this. There's no specific way that you have to do it. but there's some general guidance in the manual of procedures on page 18 there for you. I obtained this information from NIH because I just wanted to go over the importance of why we're documenting this process and what this information means. So the purpose is to assist the user in documenting the consent process, and it provides an initial framework for the discussion and process with potential study subjects. The PIs, the sub-Is, and the study coordinators are typically the ones that are involved in this process. And some best practice recommendations. If you're using the documentation of consent form that is provided in our coordinator documents, that's fine. It kind of has some little check boxes for these statements that we're going to talk about. You can also do an EMR note that kind of covers these statements as well. It doesn't have to be anything fancy or long. Some EMRs even have a template already developed that gives a general guideline for this. So if you are using EMR, you can just hit that template and fill in the necessary information that doesn't populate there. Some of the information that you want to include is the statement talking about that you've discussed the risks associated with the study, if any are known, and they were reviewed with a participant. You want to discuss if or document if there are any witnesses there. So a family member, a friend, a support person, a spouse, anything like that. And then if there were any special circumstances that were addressed. So if the person can't read, or if maybe they're having trouble writing because of tremors, and so they have their spouse sign their consent, something like that. Another thing, anything that's out of the ordinary. So if you get an inclusion or exclusion exemption, that should be documented in your documentation of consent. There's a place that says like additional notes if you're using the form, or if you are using the EMR, you definitely want to put anything that's out of the ordinary there. If they are using an LAR, you want to have that in the documentation of consent. I do have some people who say, you know, they had a really long discussion. So if you're spending an extra amount of time with somebody for any reason, they maybe have special concerns or questions that you've addressed that you don't typically get, that would be something that I would document in this process as well. So electronic storage of research documents. Sorry, is this on your guys' screen? I apologize. So I've kind of talked from the beginning, creating these what I call e-binders or e-charts for your subjects. This is a good thing to have for all of them at any time, regardless of I'm going to monitor them, because this is what's going to save you from printing out a bunch of documents and taking a bunch of space in your paper binders. So any document that you create that doesn't require a signature. So the liver score calculations are a good example of this. You can just print that to PDF, save that in these e-binders. I do suggest saving them by subject number and then organizing them by document type so that you can quickly find it when you need it. Anything that you downloaded from EMR, like the X-ray or CT impressions, anything like that that you're using as source for information that you entered in REDCap for standard of care procedures, those can all just be saved. So if you want to get back to them later, you can quickly go to them and not have to log back into EMR. And then if I don't have access to your EMR during a visit, these are definitely necessary to have ready because I'm going to have to verify those somehow. Lab results that have been reviewed. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, instead of filling out the paper CRF, you can print the lab results. However, they still have to be reviewed by the PI. Anything clinically significant has to be circled or made aware, however your institution does that, and then sign and date. But you can scan these documents back into your e-binder. You don't necessarily have to keep a huge, packet of labs available. Some people like them specifically with all their paper CRFs. But this is something that you can scan back in and not necessarily keep the paper after it's been reviewed. And you can also scan in your paper CRF. So after a visit's occurred and you have done your data entry, you can scan those paper CRFs into your eBinder and use that as your source going forward. Obviously, regulatory documents, so protocol amendments, addendums, I know that these are all required as part of the investigator site file if you look into the monitoring plan. However, you don't have to have the paper version in your binder. I've seen a lot of binders that are giant regulatory binders because they print out every single protocol and have every single version in there. And while I appreciate their consistency and how complete and accurate their documentation is, that does not leave a lot of room for other things when you're printing all of that. So training logs, financial disclosures, DOAs, all of those, once they've been reviewed initially, can be scanned and saved electronically. I do suggest, and part of the FDA guidance would also suggest to create a note to file for what documents you are storing electronically, and then keep that note to file in your physical binder. And I would do that separately for regulatory versus subject documents. So we talked about the liver score calculation. This is something that, again, can be stored electronically, but it is necessary in order to verify. Yes, I know the websites to all of the calculations, and I can look through all of your information and find the lab values and do that calculation myself, but that takes a lot of time in the middle of a visit when we're trying to get through several patients and a lot of different information for many visits. So if you have those liver score calculations available, that makes it much easier to verify those scores. And at the end of the day, you have to have them in order for me to verify your source. So even though I can verify your calculation, the number that you actually get myself, by doing that, I can't verify that you provided source. So it's really important for you to have these. And I recommend doing these in as close to real time as possible. Again, most of you are doing this, so sort of a blanket statement. So I apologize for all the people who are doing this correctly and are really organized. Maybe just a reminder or review for those people. So paper CRF versus review of EMR source. So if I do have access to your EMR source, I can review labs and things like that there to get the actual result and verify what you entered into REDCap. However, I have to see that the PI reviewed it in, like I said, as close to real time as possible. So instead of filling out the paper CRF for the vitals, for the labs, for all of the procedures, you can say see attached EMR documentation and then have those printed out. The labs do need to be signed by the PI. And then again, you can scan all of that into the eBinder, or you can put it in your paper chart. But there does have to be some way for me to see that the PI has reviewed your labs, especially eligibility labs. I would say those are probably the most important because we are trying to make sure the person was eligible. So if you do all of the eligibility information, you go ahead and randomize, and then your labs were never reviewed, or maybe they were reviewed much later, it's just not good clinical practice to go ahead and randomize somebody when their labs have not been reviewed yet. So talking about the note to file again, you guys have all done this. These are really simple documents. They're important because they explain current processes. One of the things that I talked about earlier was the documents that are stored electronically, also used to fix errors, things like that. They can explain findings from a monitoring visit, such as late signatures, documentation errors, protocol deviations. Retroactive documentation is actually a big one, especially there is a lot of turnover here. So when you have new coordinators coming in and maybe they're going back and trying to get something caught up, and so they're seeing something that someone else didn't catch the first time, this is a really good way to explain finding that retroactive issue. Information that you want to include on your note to file is the name of the person creating the document, the date, the reason for the note to file, and any related study information. So the protocol title, the PI, things like that. So everybody kind of wants to shoot the messenger sometimes. So I am just the messenger. I'm sort of the middleman in between the sponsor and the federal regulations and the GCPs. But I did want to point out too that I use on a regular basis. And so the federal guideline 21 CFR Part 11 is talking about Part 11 compliance, talks a lot about electronic records. There's a lot about EMR in there. It's a really involved document. The biggest thing that I want to point out from this document is that while we are trying to improve processes and get rid of as much paper as we can and try to help your workload and increase some efficiency, we cannot use REDCap to enter data and then print the document and then use that as source. There's something called predicate rules, and without getting really deep into that, basically, if you're doing that, then this federal regulation considers you actually using the electronic source as your original, even though you're printing out a version of that. So really important to have that original document that is not the direct REDCap data entry. And then GCP E6, one area of this, I think it's 5.18.4, goes over monitoring responsibilities. So whenever you see something, you're like, oh, why do I have to do that? Well, it's going to give you a whole list of reasons of why I have to ask you to do that. So if you want to review those, or if you have any questions, you can find them there. You can always ask me, and I can definitely point out the exact place for something, hopefully, or look for it to find an answer to your question. Okay, so we're going to move into the new SAE process. Does anybody have any questions about documentation or anything that we've gone over so far? Okay. So you've all, I'm sure, been anxiously awaiting this process. It is going to help increase efficiency, decrease your coordinator workload. Your feedback is important. Going forward, as implementation happens, feedback will be important, but just knowing that your feedback is what drove this process change in the first place. So I just wanted you to know that when you let us know things, that we are listening, and we do want to help you do things better and easier, and help you do your work on a regular basis with your subjects. So our current process, some of the challenges that we identified were that there were unnecessary or confusing fields on the paper CRF. Communication is timely and involved. There's lots of emails going back and forth between the different stakeholders. And then the Excel spreadsheet, you're having to fill that out as well to highlight the main data points for the SAE. And then a lot of duplication of data entry into REDCap, specifically the CONMEDs. So our new process, you're going to have an improved SAE report form. It's no longer 5 pages. We have it down to 2. And we will be sending that out soon and uploading it into OneDrive. Something that I think is really cool that the DCC is working on is automatic emails with the REDCap data entry to appropriate stakeholders. So this is going to kind of take away 2 things from the current process. It's going to take away you having to generate your own email with all of that information and uploading that. And it's also going to get rid of the need for the Excel. So basically all of the information that you were putting in the Excel sheet is going to be generated from your REDCap data entry and sending that to Dr. Gare and all of the other people who need to review the SAE. Let's see. I feel like another thing I wanted to point out is for the narrative and PI comments, that's going to be on the paper CRF only, and you will no longer need to enter that into REDCap. There is going to be a form upload button in REDCap when you fill out your SAE fields, and you will upload the CRF directly there. But you will no longer have to separately type in all of the narratives there. Let's see, CONMED documentation. So there will be a checkbox on the CONMED log, and it will say something like, was this med because of an SAE, yes or no? And that will be the way you document your CONMEDs. So it will be on the regular CONMED log. There will no longer be a separate log for just for SAE medications, and you won't have to separate them per SAE. We will be looking at like a date area. So if you have multiple SAEs within, like a year's time frame, we want to know, like, okay, these 3 meds were for SAE 1. So from June 20th to June 25th. And then SAE 2 was from November 1st to November 16th, something like that. So there definitely needs to be some kind of date range, not specific dates, but that way we can kind of go back and try to figure out what meds were going with which SAE without you having to put individual indications and every single exact date on every medication. Okay. Andrew, do any of you want to add anything here?
Not too much to add. I mean, with the emails, we're going to have 2 different, you guys haven't been getting them. We've still had emails going out. So anytime that you've had an SAE, you guys have potentially seen the little description box that shows up at the bottom saying that an email will be sent out to the DCC. We're going to have 2 different ones. So one goes to just us as the DCC, and then others will go to the NIAAA who review these as well, just based off some different logic. So you still most likely won't be getting any emails with that. So I know you guys have gotten a lot of emails already with enrollment and things like that. We don't want to burden your inbox any more than we already have. But just note that that is kind of the process that's going to be going forward. We have alerts that go out just constantly for us. So if there's any alert, just kind of taking this opportunity, if there's any alert that you guys feel would be beneficial for you guys as well, to make sure that things are entered in right, or you want to just have note of it. Sometimes it's easier to check email than REDCap. Let us know. They're not too hard to set up. And we can definitely discuss that. I want to be as beneficial to you guys as possible. And I know the alerts, at least for me, I find them very beneficial, but given your guys' role, maybe they aren't as beneficial, I don't know. So just speak up if you have any thoughts about that. But that's it for me.
Andrew, I did want to ask, I know that at one point you changed the alerts so that the site came through in the subject line, so we knew which site it was. Will that be able to continue for this as well?
Yeah, as you guys probably noticed, you only get data for the coordinators. They only get data for their site. We add them to a specific group that is dependent on their site. So as long as they're added to that group, that's how it triggers. So if somebody, let's just say from Cleveland Clinic, enters in data, if the triggers then, if the alert is triggered to send based off something that a Cleveland Clinic coordinator has entered in, then that's how the site field is triggered. Hopefully this is making a little bit of sense. So the site can be there. I can also add URLs. So if you ever want a field to be triggered, so that way you can have a quick link and it brings you to that specific field. This is something that I just learned how to do as well. So there's a lot of really cool things. And as long as it's a field within REDCap, I typically can trigger the alert to have that information added. So feel free, even if you may think it's a long shot, maybe ask. So yeah, hopefully that answered the question.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. I appreciate it. And then I will just take this time to say either now or after this, after you've had a chance to think about it, before we finalize those paper CRFs and we start implementing this new process, if there's anything that maybe you've thought about that you haven't said yet, or during this talk, you thought, oh, you know, we should also do this, or we should think about that, go ahead and let us know. And, you know, I'm not saying that we can change it at this point, but maybe we can, and definitely take it into consideration if we do an update soon. So anything that you'd like to add to this process or any other processes, we definitely appreciate your feedback. Okay. So the resources that will be available during implementation and throughout the rest of the study. So there will be a new SAE report form. There are going to be two separate ones, an initial form that has all of the initial information. It will be a little bit different, and I'm going to give you a quick view of that. And then there's a follow-up form. So we're not going to be having you fill out all of that information again. And then just updating, you know, the few fields that we need to be updated for what's considered a follow-up. An SAE guidance document has been created, as well as an SAE standard operating procedure. So those will be available to you. The guidance document is kind of like a quick look at it, to where if you just want a really quick look, okay, what do I do next now? It'll have it there. The operating procedure is going to give you really in-depth step-by-step information to go back and look at. And then we will also be creating and conducting a training session once everything is finalized for the paper CRF, and then the changes have been made and are working properly in REDCap. And then also, you know, Dr. Gare, Savannah, DCC, and myself, we are always available to help you. So you can reach out to me anytime. And they're very available as well and accommodating. I did want to say that I'm going to be starting a twice monthly office hours. So I'm going to send a doodle poll out for the best day of the week and time. So the 2 top days of the week and the 2 top times are what I'm going to do, and I'll just spread them out throughout the month. So anybody can join. I'll just be online, and you can join and ask any questions that maybe you've been thinking about. And then anybody who wants to schedule for any individual discussions. I know I talked about new coordinators once they get onboarded, having some discussions. Happy to do that one-on-one as well. And before I get to the questions, something that I forgot to talk about, Andrew, I might ask you about this again. Talking about that Part 11 compliance, there is a button currently in REDCap that says, did you enter this data from a paper CRF, or did you enter it from direct data entry? And because that direct data entry makes it look like you know, you don't have a source that you're coming from, we are going to be, well, I'm not, but Andrew and the DCC are going to be removing that option from the CRFs. I don't know exactly which ones it's on. I've seen it set on several different ones. I don't know how long that process takes or exactly when that will happen, but I just wanted to make you aware.
I can jump in here.
Sure.
I believe, at least for the SAE, that has actually already been hidden. So you guys won't be seeing that. We push that forward through. So both the field that says whether it was direct entry into REDCap or paper CRF, that field is hidden. And then also the electronic signature field is hidden because we need the signature to be on the paper form and not in REDCap. So those are, you should no longer be seeing them. If we haven't checked, I think, every form, unless Ronnie, you can kind of speak up because I know you're the one that implemented this. But there may be another field or two. Anytime that we catch it, we're probably going to be hiding that as quickly as possible because we do need those paper forms. So just keep a note of that.
Hi, this is Ronnie here. I just wanted to add up to what Andrew was mentioning. So as of right now, at least on the production database, I have removed those, not removed, but hidden those fields that specify whether it was direct data entry or not. And since there were a few fields that are sub-depending on it, they will be hidden in the future, but it won't affect the data that was entered. Those are fields like the PI signature, PI data review, and stuff like that. In the future, they won't come out because they are sub-depending on those fields, but for the data that is there, it still will remain. I don't think that will impede in the functionality of it at all. But the idea was to have the database edited in a way that it wouldn't require for anybody to go back and edit any data that is already there or start seeing pop-up messages as it happens all the time. We can say that they have been removed, but if there's like one or two here and there that anyone happens to notice, you can pass it out to us and we'll take care of it. But as of right now, I basically went through the whole database and hit those fields already.
Great, thank you so much.
Sure.
Okay, so does anybody have any questions about anything that we talked about today for anybody, any of our UMass team or IUDCC team, or anything that we didn't discuss today that you have any questions about? Okay, well, I appreciate you all joining. I'll give you 6 minutes of your life back. And thank you all for all of your hard work. We really do appreciate it. And we will let you know the closer we get to implementing our new process.
Hey, Rachel, just a quick thing. I just remember that email we were talking about the drug accountability form.
Oh, yeah. Yes. Okay, I will bring that up here. So I was doing a visit this week and noticed that there's only the option to enter the drug accountability form one time. And I know you guys are checking at subsequent visits up until day 90. So I was wondering, I know that you guys have paper forms. Is everybody just keeping that information on your paper CRFs, or where have you been keeping that to date? And then Ronnie, you are going to make that to where that can be a repeating form, is that correct? So that do you want that information entered retroactively, or how do we want to fix that?
Like we were talking in the email, I think the best approach that we agreed on will be making it a repeatable form and adding an extra field to specify to which visit the entry is pertinent to.
Okay.
With regard of data entry and retroactive data entry, I think that's something that we will need more time to discuss with Carla. Now, what I wanted to mention was when you first brought this issue to me, my first reaction was like, where was the data being collected? And that also made me think if there is any other forms out there, if there's any other data that needs to be collected in the database that's not being collected in there, for you guys to bring it up to us, because we need to have this data in RedGap. That's just it.
Yeah, so if there's anything that you guys are collecting on your paper form at each visit or on a regular basis, and then when you're going to do your data entry, you realize that there's not a place for it to be entered. If you could let us know that, specifically Ronnie, that would be very helpful.
Yeah, quick note, just send the email to the HNA data for the whole team to see.
Okay. And I'll add all this information into the minutes that I haven't really taken yet. So if there's nothing else, then I will let you all go. So I appreciate you bearing with me today. And thanks so much for joining. Have a good day.
Thanks, Rachel.
Bye.
Bye. You too.
I'll see you guys.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thanks.